Picture this. You're sitting on your couch. It's been a long, exhausting day.
Oh, yeah, we all know that feeling.
Yeah, exactly. The kind of day where your brain just feels like static. So you pull out your phone, looking for a little bit of a distraction, maybe some entertainment.
Just a quick dopamine hit.
Right. But you open up your feed and instantly you're hit with this absolute wall of outrage.
It's everywhere.
It really is. Like, someone is furious about a new political decision, tearing it apart paragraph by paragraph. Someone else is actively dismantling a public figure's entire life, their career, their reputation, all based on, like, a 10-second video clip that's been circulating for an hour.
And the comment sections are just a war zone.
Oh, a complete war zone. People are threatening each other, moral posturing, drawing these massive lines in the sand. And as you sit there and scroll, you can actually feel your own physiological response.
Your body reacts to it.
Yes. Your blood pressure ticks up. Your breathing gets a little shallower. You feel this intense, almost magnetic pull to just jump into the fray, right? To pick a side, make a snap judgment, and declare someone in that scenario the absolute villain and someone else the unquestionable hero.
It is an incredibly seductive environment. I mean, we are hardwired to resolve ambiguity.
Right, we want to know who the good guys are.
Exactly. When we're presented with high-stakes social friction, our brains desperately want to categorize the threat. We want to know who is safe and who is dangerous. But that instinct, especially when it's scaled up to the level of global digital networks, it creates a massive blind spot.
A blind spot how? Like, we just missed the bigger picture.
We miss the entire structural reality. We are swimming in this ocean of continuous conflict, but we have almost no shared framework for understanding what that conflict is actually doing structurally.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, we see friction, we see people upset, and we immediately assume, okay, this is a catastrophic emergency, and I need to react right this exact second.
And that reaction is almost always aggressive, isn't it? It feels like we are completely losing the ability to tell the difference between a necessary, healthy argument and a completely destructive one.
Which is incredibly dangerous for any functioning society.
Totally. So that is our mission for this deep dive. We are exploring a fascinating intersection of sociological frameworks, philosophical arguments, and structural theory today.
It's a really profound set of texts we're looking at.
It really is. These sources challenge how we view authority, how we interpret the conflict happening around us, and critically, how we wield our own judgment when the pressure is on.
Because the pressure is always on these days.
Always. We're going to figure out how to distinguish between destructive, nihilistic conflict and the kind of necessary, painful correction that our society and our own individual lives actually require.
And escaping this modern trap of performative outrage is going to require a serious level of personal maturity.
And discipline. A kind of discipline that most of our current digital platforms are, frankly, actively trying to train out of us.
That's the truth. To even begin untangling this, we really have to look past the surface noise.
You mean like the Angie posts and the political shouting matches?
Exactly. Those are just symptoms. The underlying mechanics of human behavior dictate why we rush to judgment in the first place. We have to ask why we possess this overwhelming demand for simple, binary answers to complex, multi-layered problems.
So it's about diagnosing the urge before we can treat the symptom.
Right. Once we map the structural diagnosis of those urges, we can actually start to dismantle them and build a more resilient way of moving through the world.
Well, before we can even begin to understand all this modern conflict, we have to look at our relationship with authority.
Which is where the texts get really interesting.
Super provocative. The foundational argument here suggests that our rush to judgment, our panic when we open our phones, comes from this deep, almost desperate desire for authority to be simple.
We want it to be simple so badly.
We really do. We fundamentally want one person or one single institution to just hand us the truth so we don't have to do the heavy lifting of figuring it out ourselves.
Well, it's an issue of cognitive load, right?
Cognitive load. Break that down for me.
Sure. Processing a complex reality where multiple competing truths exist simultaneously is exhausting. Our brains just get tired. So humanity developed defense mechanisms, and one of the absolute oldest is the centralization of authority.
Okay, so we designate a boss to make the hard calls.
Exactly. And if we look at this through a sociological lens, specifically using the structure of Christianity as a model for how human beings organize belief, we see a brilliant illustration of this divide.
Yeah, the sources bring this up, and it's fascinating.
There is this common assumption in modern discourse that following a religious path, like the teachings of Jesus, automatically requires submitting to a singular, centralized human authority, like the Pope
Right.
but structurally.
Mm-hmm.
That is a profound misunderstanding of how belief systems operate across different populations.
Which is so compelling because whether you listening are religious or not, the structural breakdown of this is completely applicable to how we organize everything, from corporate structures to, political movements.
Oh, absolutely.
The argument is that reducing a massive global belief system to a single human authority isn't just a simplification, it actively distorts how the religion exists in the world.
From a purely sociological standpoint, Christianity has never operated under one unified structure of authority.
Right, there's always been a split.
Exactly. The historical divide between Catholic and Protestant traditions is often viewed purely as a theological debate. But if you look at it structurally, it is a massive debate about where authority inherently resides.
Okay, let's unpack that structural difference.
Well, Catholicism centralizes authority. It utilizes the papacy and the magisterium as an institutional, singular interpreter of doctrine.
So there's a clear hierarchy.
Yes, a pyramid.
Yeah.
And truth flows down through it. It's designed to minimize ambiguity for the followers. Protestant traditions, on the other hand, structurally reject that model entirely.
They don't have a pope.
Right. They assert that the core text, the scripture, stands above any single human interpreter. That means authority is distributed, it's decentralized, and interpretation becomes this collective, albeit fragmented, responsibility.
So when people look at a complex issue and say, well, it's simple, just follow the leader, they're completely ignoring the reality that millions of people globally just do not recognize that centralized authority.
It's not a bug, it's a feature of their system.
Exactly. It isn't a fringe rebellion to question the leader. It's
Yeah.
the structural reality of how their system was built. But let me push back on this for a second.
Sure, go for it.
Let's be honest here. Isn't it just functionally easier to have one person tell us what is right? I mean, I don't figure out my own medical diagnoses. I trust a doctor.
Right.
I don't build my own car engine. I trust a mechanic. So why is moral or structural authority any different? Why shouldn't we just find the smartest or most righteous person and do what they say?
That distinction between technical expertise and moral philosophy is exactly where the trap lies. Yeah. Technical expertise is empirically verifiable. If a mechanic fixes your engine, the car starts. The outcome is objectively measurable right there in front of you.
Okay, that makes sense.
But moral and structural authority does not work that way because human societies are not engines. They are living, breathing, constantly shifting ecosystems.
So you can't just apply a wrench to a social issue.
Exactly. When you treat any single individual or institution as the exclusive, unquestionable interpreter of moral truth, you end up replacing the rigorous work of ongoing analysis with what the texts call a forced equivalence.
Wait, a forced equivalence. What does that actually look like in practice?
It means you equate the person with the truth.
Oh, I see.
You stop evaluating the action, the context, or the consequences of what's happening,
Yeah.
and you simply evaluate the source. You say to yourself, well, if this person said it, it must be right.
It becomes a defense mechanism against complexity.
Precisely. You are essentially telling yourself, I do not need to understand the historical nuances, the economic factors, or the structural forces at play. I just need to know who is in charge and what their official stance is.
And that turns something that is meant to be deeply understood and negotiated into something that is merely followed blindly.
Yes. It bypasses history, ignores vital distinctions in context, and it replaces genuine, robust clarity with a very fragile kind of reduction.
Fragile because if the leader messes up, it all falls apart.
Exactly. If that one central authority fails or is proven corrupt, the entire worldview shatters because the individual follower never actually learned how to parse the truth themselves.
Wow. And that fragility is exactly what we are seeing everywhere right now. People put all their faith in a singular political figure or a singular thought leader on social media, and when that person missteps, their followers are stuck.
They either have to undergo extreme cognitive dissonance to defend the person, or their entire belief system collapses.
Which brings us to the political parallel. Because this framework, this warning against centralizing unquestionable authority, applies directly to American politics.
The underlying human impulse is identical. We look for popes in our politics.
Popes in our politics. I love that phrasing.
It's true, though. We are desperate for a singular moral authority figure who can validate our specific worldview, punish our ideological enemies, and banish all the ambiguity from our daily lives.
But the structural design of the United States was emphatically built to resist a central moral authority.
Emphatically. The framework is constitutional, meaning authority is distributed across branches, it's checked by competing interests, and it is strictly limited by design.
Yeah, the focus on the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights in the source material is critical here. The phrasing used to describe these documents is so vital. They exist to constrain leadership, not to sanctify it.
That is the absolute core of the political argument. James Madison and the framers were terrified of centralized moral authority.
They assumed leaders would be flawed.
Right. Flawed, ambitious, and deeply biased. Therefore, a president is not a sovereign king. And even more importantly, a president is not the moral arbiter for the nation.
Then what are they, structurally speaking?
A president is simply a representative of a specific temporary coalition of interests. That's it.
Let's look at Donald Trump as a specific example of this dynamic because the text uses him as a perfect stress test for this theory. And to be incredibly clear to you listening, we are not doing this to endorse his politics or to condemn his politics.
Right, this is a purely structural analysis.
Exactly. We are looking at his presidency purely as a structural example of how democratic representation functions. The structural reality is that when a figure like Donald Trump is elected, that outcome reflects a very real, very tangible constituency.
Which forces us to confront how we actually define legitimacy.
What do you mean?
There's a modern reflex to argue that the representation of a constituency suddenly disappears or becomes structurally illegitimate, simply because another portion of the population finds that representation deeply unpopular, uncomfortable, or morally misguided.
So because I don't like it, it must be an illegitimate outcome.
Right. But a democratic system does not guarantee moral clarity. It does not promise that the outcome will be universally beloved or even that the outcome will be objectively good in the long run.
What does it guarantee then?
What it guarantees is participation and friction.
But if I am a voter and I look at an election result, whether it's Trump or Biden or anyone else, and I believe that the person elected is fundamentally flawed or dangerous, how am I supposed to view the system as legitimate?
It's difficult.
It is. You hear people on both sides of the aisle constantly saying, the system is broken, the system is illegitimate, our democracy is over, every single time they lose.
And that panic is the exact symptom of wanting a political pope.
Oh, wow. Okay.
When we demand that our political leaders be unquestionable moral authorities, and they inevitably fail to be that for the entire country, we just assume the system is collapsing.
Because our expectations were wrong from the start.
Precisely. The presence of tension, intense conflict, or even a perceived failure in leadership is not necessarily evidence of systemic collapse.
Then what is it?
It's often an expression of the system doing exactly what it was designed to do. Process competing, deeply divided constituencies without resorting to physical warfare. The system is a pressure valve.
So whether you view a specific representative's tenure as highly competent or totally disastrous, it doesn't negate the structural legitimacy of how they arrived in office.
Exactly. When we expect the presidency to provide us with profound moral comfort, we are asking the system to do something it was specifically designed not to do.
We are asking for a unified, infallible leader from a system that was built by people who structurally operated like political Protestants. They designed it so authority was distributed and contested.
A perfect way to summarize it.
But this leaves me with a massive practical problem.
Okay, what is it?
Well, if truth and moral clarity do not flow down from a single, unquestionable authority, whether that's a religious leader, a president, or a perfectly curated news network, then how am I actually supposed to grasp what is real?
That is the big question.
Right. If I can't just look at the person at the podium and say, whatever they say is the absolute truth, what's the alternative? How do I navigate the world without a map given to me by someone else?
That leads to one of the most demanding concepts we have to explore from these sources, the complete redefinition of what knowing actually entails.
Because it's not just listening and repeating.
No. Because if authority is not a synonym for truth, then acquiring truth requires a completely different kind of engagement. It requires moving away from the crowd mentality.
The idea that if enough people say it, it must be true.
Exactly. True understanding is not a secondhand system of inherited opinions.
It's the difference between memorizing a slogan and deeply understanding the philosophy behind it. You know, you don't just passively absorb other people's beliefs, pledge your loyalty to a cultural tribe, put the right flag in your social media bio, and suddenly know the truth.
But we have conflated knowledge with tribal alignment. We really have. We assume that if we adopt the right public posture, if we use the correct terminology that signals we belong to the good group, then we possess knowledge.
But the text argues that's not real knowledge.
No. Truth is a form of contextual knowledge. It's lived, It is realized through experience, and it is highly dependent on variables that cannot be easily codified into a top 10 list.
So, if I can play this back, trying to understand the extreme complexities of geopolitics or human psychology or social justice by just memorizing what the crowd tells you is like trying to learn how to swim by reading a textbook on dry land.
I love that analogy. It's spot on.
Like, I can sit in my living room and memorize all the physics of buoyancy. I can know exactly what angle my arm is supposed to enter the water. I can even pass a written test on the mechanics of the butterfly stroke.
You'd get an A+ on the paper.
Right. But the second I actually jump into the deep end of the pool, I am going to sink. Because I don't have the lived context of the water, I don't know what the resistance feels like against my skin.
That captures the deficit perfectly. Contextual knowledge is not empirical in the narrow modern sense.
Meaning you can't just measure it on a chart.
Right. You cannot just measure it with a ruler, plug it into an algorithm, or verify it by pointing to a consensus of thousands of retweets. Contextual knowledge requires the application of judgment.
It requires lived experience.
Lived experience, a developed sense of proportion, timing, wisdom, and, crucially, mercy. It demands that you understand the meaning of an action within its specific lived context, rather than just judging the action in a vacuum.
So you don't become wise by submitting to a hierarchy or memorizing the textbook?
No, you become wise through the friction of engagement and through learning to recognize the underlying structure of a situation.
Which brings up a really sharp observation from the sources about how we communicate today. The real issue in our public discourse isn't whether someone can perfectly quote a text.
It's too easy to quote things out of context.
It is so easy to pull a Bible verse out of context, or quote a line from the Constitution, or throw out a clever cultural reference to win an argument. I mean, anyone can memorize a line from Pulp Fiction and repeat it at a party to sound interesting.
Oh, for sure.
But quoting Quentin Tarantino doesn't mean you actually know how to direct a movie.
But this is the critical distinction between repetition and recognition.
Repetition versus recognition. Let's dig into that.
Repetition is incredibly easy, and our modern digital platforms are built entirely to facilitate it. You hear a talking point on a cable news show, or you see an infographic on Instagram. You log onto your own account, and you repeat it.
And then you get the likes.
You get likes, you get dopamine, you feel validated by your crowd, and your brain actually mistakes that positive feedback loop for actual knowledge. You think you are learning, but you are just echoing.
Okay, so that's repetition. What is recognition?
Recognition, on the other hand, is excruciatingly difficult. Recognition means looking at a complex, chaotic, fast-moving situation and having the disciplined capacity to interpret the structural reality of what is actually happening. It means looking past the surface appearances and the loud noises.
But how do we know if our contextual recognition is actually right? Like, how do I know I'm recognizing the underlying structure and not just projecting my own biases onto it?
That's a very fair concern.
Right. If I throw away the map provided by the central authority and I have to rely on my own lived context, couldn't I just be wildly wrong?
You absolutely will be wrong sometimes, and that is a feature, not a bug, of contextual knowledge.
Right, really? It's a feature.
Yes. It requires an iterative process of testing your judgment against reality. It requires humility. If you rely solely on centralized authority, your primary goal is obedience.
Just do what you're told.
Right. But if you rely on contextual knowledge, your primary goal is comprehension. And comprehension requires you to adjust your understanding when the context shifts.
So you have to be willing to change your mind.
Exactly. It requires you to look at a situation and ask, what are the historical precedents here? Who benefits from this narrative? What are the second and third order consequences of this action?
That is a huge cognitive burden.
It is a massive cognitive burden, which is exactly why we so often retreat back to repetition. It's just easier.
This sets up the absolute core of our discussion today, because if true understanding requires us to read the context of a situation, instead of just blindly submitting to an authority or repeating what the crowd is screaming, then we have to fundamentally change the way we look at friction.
We really do.
We have to change how we process the intense conflicts happening in our communities and on our screens. We can't just categorize all conflict as an emergency.
And this requires a massive paradigm shift because it forces us to reevaluate our relationship with disturbance, with discomfort, and ultimately with pain.
We have to differentiate between what we might call good pain and bad pain. But how do we even begin to draw that line?
Well, the sources offer a brilliant metaphor. Think about the physical body. Sometimes a bone that has healed improperly has to be intentionally rebroken by a surgeon in order to be set correctly.
Oh man, that is such a visceral, wince-inducing image. Re-breaking a bone.
I know it is visceral, but it's visceral because it highlights the necessity of trauma for the sake of restoration.
Okay, unpack that for me.
In our modern culture, we have developed this hypersensitive reflex where we view all pain, all discomfort, and all societal friction as inherently bad.
Yeah, if there's tension, it must be toxic.
Exactly. The moment there is tension, the moment someone is offended or a protest erupts or an institution faces intense scrutiny, we just assume a profound injustice is occurring or that the system is actively collapsing. But if you lack contextual knowledge, you treat all pain as identical.
So bad pain is like the bone breaking in a car crash.
Yes, exactly.
It's chaotic, it's unintended, and it fundamentally damages the function of the body. It is indiscriminate destruction.
A perfect example of bad pain.
But good pain is the surgeon looking at an arm, seeing that the bone healed crooked, realizing that the patient is losing mobility, and knowing that the only way to restore the arm's true function is to cause immense intentional trauma.
Right. The pain of the surgery is intense. It requires a long recovery, but it is not pointless. It isolates the specific rot or misalignment, and it is the unavoidable cost of repair.
Okay, so let's scale that physical metaphor up to how social life institutions and nations operate, because it feels revelatory.
It truly is. A nation does not always grow by avoiding strain. In fact, a society that avoids all strain is usually decaying quietly.
Decaying quietly under the surface.
Yes. Sometimes a society grows only by being forced to confront what it truly is, what biases it has permitted, what foundational rot it has neglected, and what must now be corrected in full, excruciating public view.
But here's where I struggle, and where I think anyone listening would naturally struggle.
Okay, what's the hang-up?
How do I, as an individual, sitting on my couch watching the evening news, look at society and know the difference? Like when I see massive protests in the streets, or institutional gridlock, or a university completely melting down over an ideological divide.
Which happens constantly now.
Constantly. How do I know when the system is actually collapsing into nihilistic chaos, and when it is just exposing its hidden flaws so it can be set straight? In the moment, the car crash and the surgery both feature a person screaming in pain. How do I measure it?
That is the ultimate test of contextual knowledge. And there is a very clear warning we must heed here. Discomfort alone is never a sufficient moral argument.
Wow, say that again. Discomfort alone is never a sufficient moral argument.
Right. We have this tendency to treat disturbance itself as proof of injustice. If people are upset, we think someone must have done something evil. But we have to look at the mechanics of the disturbance.
What are we looking for in the mechanics?
We have to ask, is the conflict isolating a specific structural problem with the intent of forcing accountability and eventual restoration, like the surgeon? Or is the conflict indiscriminate? Is it attacking the foundations of the structure itself with no vision for what comes after the destruction, like the car crash?
So we have to look at the intent and the target.
Yes. Disturbance might actually be the long overdue unveiling of a deeper disorder that society had previously hidden away through convenience, habit, or sentimentality.
Convenience and habit. Let's make that concrete. It's kind of like having a slow, leaky pipe inside the wall of your living room.
That's a great way to look at it.
Yeah, for 10 years you don't see the water. The drywall looks perfect. Your house feels completely fine. That is the convenience and habit. You are comfortable.
But behind the wall, it's a disaster.
Exactly. The wood is slowly rotting away. The structural integrity is failing. Then one day, a plumber comes in, identifies the rot, and takes a sledgehammer to your beautiful living room wall.
Which is terrifying for the homeowner.
It looks like absolute destruction. There is dust everywhere. There is a giant, jagged hole in your house. It feels chaotic, and it is incredibly stressful. But the sledgehammer isn't the actual problem.
No, the hidden rot is the problem.
Right. The sledgehammer is just the disturbance required to finally expose the rot so you don't lose the whole house.
Let's take that analogy a step further, though. If you lack contextual knowledge, if you only operate on shallow judgment and a demand for immediate comfort, you walk into that living room, you see a man with a sledgehammer smashing your wall, and you immediately assume he's a vandal trying to destroy your life.
Because you only see the immediate pain.
Yes. You see the broken wall, and your brain bypasses analysis. You assume the pain itself is evil. You don't pause to ask what caused the plumber to swing the hammer. You don't ask if he's exposing rot. You don't ask if this is part of an overdue correction. You just react to the mess on the floor.
You scream at the plumber, you kick him out of the house, you patch up the hole with some cheap spackle so it looks nice again, and 5 years later, your roof collapses.
Precisely. And that reaction, kicking out the plumber because you hate the mess, requires zero patience.
Oh.
True discernment, whether we are talking about maintaining a lawful society, managing a corporate structure, or navigating a truly religious mind, requires immense personal discipline.
It's hard to just sit there and watch the wall come down.
It's incredibly hard. A healthy society doesn't prove it is healthy by successfully avoiding every hard outcome or suppressing every conflict. That is the illusion of authoritarianism, forcing quiet and calling it peace.
Man, forcing quiet and calling it peace.
A healthy society proves its vitality by having the patience and the structural resilience to endure the painful process of correction.
But patience with the process feels almost impossible today because every single tool we use to communicate incentivizes us to do the exact opposite.
They profit off of impatience.
They really do. If we fail to recognize the difference between a broken bone being surgically set and a bone just being shattered in a crash, we panic. And that panic leads us directly into the modern plague of performative outrage.
Because we don't wait to see if it's surgery.
No, we just start screaming that the hospital is under attack.
Let's examine the anatomy of that snap judgment. Why do our brains do this?
Yeah, structurally, what's happening to us?
We have developed a cultural habit of flattening absolutely everything into an instant conclusion. You see a headline designed to trigger your amygdala. You watch a 5-second, tightly edited clip, completely devoid of its original context.
Which happens 10 times a day.
Exactly. And within 30 seconds, you are typing out an absolute, definitive statement condemning a stranger to the void. You bypass the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for complex contextual analysis and anticipating future consequences, and you react purely on a survival level.
Because in that moment, the shallow judgment feels incredibly satisfying. It feels like you are doing something productive. But why does it fail so spectacularly to actually fix anything?
It fails because it lacks proportion. When you make a snap judgment, you see the immediate pain or the immediate offense, you assume it is purely malevolent, and you react before you understand the structural cause.
So you're just reacting to the surface.
Right. What you are fundamentally lacking in that moment is a sense of scale and proportion. You're replacing deep discernment with an emotional reflex. And without that discipline, your judgment stops being a tool for resolving conflict and becomes purely performative.
Performative is the perfect word for it. It is not about solving the problem. It's about making sure everyone else in your digital tribe sees you being sufficiently angry about the problem.
It's virtue signaling disguised as action.
Exactly. It substitutes emotional certainty for actual understanding. It's a performance of righteousness. And there's an incredibly stark warning in the sources that we have to talk about here. It's a simple law of physics that applies directly to our social dynamics. If you fan a fire, it gets bigger.
It is insidious because of the delusion involved in fanning that fire. People who engage in performative outrage genuinely believe that by reacting with intense, immediate hostility, they are defending the truth.
You think that they're the good guys.
They believe they are the vanguard of justice. But escalation is not wisdom. Snap judgments, quick condemnations, and dogpiling on social media do not clarify the underlying issues. They amplify the conflict while masquerading as a resolution.
It's like we think being the loudest, most visibly outraged person at the scene of the fire somehow makes us the firefighter.
Oh, that's a brilliant way to phrase it.
Like we pull up to the burning building, we start screaming at the top of our lungs about how hot the fire is, we start throwing lawn chairs into the windows to demonstrate how angry we are that the building is burning, and we genuinely believe in our hearts that we are helping.
When in reality, we are just pouring gasoline on the structure.
We are feeding the heat, but we are providing zero light.
And that highlights the critical psychological trap. People intensify the conflict, they throw the chairs, and then they mistake the size of the flames for the strength of their own righteousness.
Because the fire is getting bigger, they feel more powerful.
Exactly. Because their argument is getting louder, because their outrage is going viral and receiving thousands of likes, they assume they must be on the side of profound moral truth. The metric for success shifts from did we solve the problem to did we make the biggest noise?
Which is completely unhelpful.
Completely. But again, it goes back to a lack of structural understanding. Escalation mimics action, but it actually prevents the deep, methodical work of resolution. It ensures the bone never actually gets set. It just keeps getting broken over and over again.
So we have walked through this entire minefield today. We have seen the trap of wanting a simple, singular authority figure to do all our critical thinking for us.
Right.
We have realized we need to ditch the secondhand slogans and do the hard work of developing lived contextual knowledge. We have learned that we have to patiently distinguish between the indiscriminate bad pain of destruction and the necessary surgical good pain of correction.
It's a lot to ask of a person.
It really is. And we've seen how performative outrage just burns the entire house down while pretending to save it.
So what is the actual practical solution? How do we navigate a world that is constantly trying to trigger us?
The solution requires a radical structural shift in how we behave on an individual level. It calls for cultivating quiet, informed discernment.
Quiet discernment. Yes. It elevates practical wisdom over emotional reflex. And it defined wisdom in a very specific, highly challenging way. Wisdom is waiting long enough to distinguish between what is merely inflammatory and what is actually revelatory.
Waiting long enough. Those three words are completely antithetical to how modern society operates. The internet does not want you to wait long enough.
No, the algorithms are specifically designed to penalize waiting.
If you don't react in the first hour, you miss the trend entirely.
The speed of modern discourse is the absolute enemy of contextual knowledge. To wait requires immense discipline. You have to actively resist the biological urge to join the mob.
Which takes real effort.
It does. And this leads to what I think is one of the most profound redefinitions we need to internalize from these texts, the redefinition of compassion.
Okay, how are we redefining compassion?
Well, in modern parlance, compassion has been diluted. It is often equated with unconditional validation. If someone is upset or a group is angry, modern society tells us that compassion means blindly agreeing with their outrage and validating their emotional state without question.
Right, because if you question them, you are immediately accused of lacking empathy. But true compassion isn't just blanket agreement. That feels like a massive pivot.
It is a heavy, necessary pivot. Compassion is not mere agreement. Compassion is discipline in how your judgment is applied.
Right.
Compassion is restraint.
Restraint.
It's having the maturity to understand that human beings, deeply entrenched institutions, and complex societies do not change cleanly. They change through exposure, fracture, and conflict. Unconditional validation is often just cowardice disguised as empathy.
Cowardice? How so?
It is taking the easy way out so the crowd doesn't turn on you. True compassion isn't jumping into the fray and screaming alongside everyone else. True compassion is having the disciplined capacity to stand in the middle of the mess and ask, what is actually happening here?
Is this moment destructive chaos that needs to be stopped, or is it a painful correction that needs to be guided?
Exactly.
But doesn't restraint sometimes look like apathy? Like, if there's a massive injustice happening and I say, well, I'm going to wait and exercise informed discernment, aren't I just using my privilege to ignore the problem while people are hurting?
That is the most common counterargument, but it fundamentally misunderstands what informed discernment is. Discernment is not inaction. It is the preparation for effective action.
So it's about aiming before you fire.
Yes. Rushing in blindly and fanning the flames might feel like you are helping, but if you haven't identified the actual structural rot, you are likely just causing collateral damage. Discernment is the discipline of making sure that when you do swing the sledgehammer, you are hitting the rotting pipe and not just smashing a load-bearing wall for the thrill of the destruction.
It is a massive call to maturity for anyone listening. To navigate the world this way, you have to completely stop borrowing your judgments from the crowd. You cannot rely on your customized echo chamber to tell you who the good guys and the bad guys are.
You have to take on the cognitive load yourself.
And it's exhausting. It is a rigorous, exhausting demand. Whether you place your faith in a religious structure or you place your faith in the civic religion of the law and the Constitution, you cannot confuse that faith with naivete.
Faith is not a blind, infantile trust in surface appearances. It demands a highly difficult kind of intelligence. It demands the courage to be temporarily unpopular while you figure out the truth.
You have to constantly be analyzing your own reactions. You have to ask yourself, what kind of fire is being fed right now? Is it a controlled burn clearing out the dead brush? Or is it a wildfire heading for the town?
That's the perfect diagnostic tool.
And critically, you have to ask, what response for me, what comment, what vote, what conversation will actually lead to light instead of just generating more heat?
It means trading the easy, chemically addictive rush of performative escalation for the quiet, often unglamorous, and deeply challenging work of informed discernment. It is recognizing that the truth is rarely as simple as a slogan,
That authority is never synonymous with perfection.
and that true understanding is a lived practice that you have to actively maintain every single day.
So if I am looking at my phone right now, the first step is realizing I don't need a singular pope to tell me how to feel about the news. I have to throw away the textbook on swimming and actually get in the water, developing that deep, lived, contextual knowledge.
Absolutely.
I have to accept that when I see conflict, it might just be the ugly, necessary process of exposing hidden rot, the good pain of correction. And I have to recognize that fanning the flames of outrage only creates more heat, while completely failing to provide the light we actually need to fix the problem.
The next time you are scrolling and you feel that familiar spike of adrenaline, that immediate burning physiological urge to publicly condemn something, to jump into the comments and unleash a devastating snap judgment, stop.
Just pause.
Yes. Ask yourself one diagnostic question before you type a single word. Am I actually trying to provide light, or am I just addicted to the heat?
That is the question. Am I addicted to the heat?
I would challenge anyone listening to try something radical this week. When you encounter a complex, inflammatory situation, a viral video, a political scandal, a cultural flashpoint, sit with the discomfort of it for just one extra day.
Give yourself 24 hours.
24 hours of absolute restraint. Do not post. Do not condemn. Wait long enough to gather the context. Wait long enough to decide if the pain you are seeing in the world is an act of nihilistic destruction, or if it is just the deeply uncomfortable but entirely necessary setting of a broken bone.
It changes everything when you look at it that way. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us today. It is not easy to challenge our own reflexes, and it is uncomfortable to realize how often we just add to the noise.
It's lifelong work.
It really is. But finding that discipline is the only way we actually move forward without burning it all down. Stay curious, keep seeking the why behind all the noise, and we will catch you on the next one.